Section 23 of The Female Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Downey. The Female Detective by Andrew Forrester. The Unknown Weapon, Part 7. A letter was dispatched that night to town, directing the police to find out who Joseph Spencer was, and giving the address heading the letter, a printed one. Mrs. Green then came into operation. No, she could not tell who lived at the address I mentioned. Thank the blessed stars, she knowed not O'Lunnon. What? Where had Mrs. Quinion been that morning? Why, to Joe Higgins. What for? Why, to look at the young squire's clothes and things. What did she want with them? Why, she actually wanted to take 'em all oop to the hall. No, Joe Higgins wouldn't. Of course I now surmised that Joseph Spencer was the butler, and my information from town showed I was right. Now certain as to my preliminaries, I knew that my work lay within the walls of the hall. But how was I to reach that place? Alas, the tricks of detective police officers are infinite. I am afraid many a kindly disposed advertisement hides the hoof of detection. At all events I know, mine did. It appeared in the second column of the Times, and here is an exact copy of it. By the way, I had received the Times daily, as do most detectives, during the time I had been in Tram. Wanted. To hear of Margaret Quinion or her heirs at law. She was known to have left the south of England. That she was a Southerner I had learnt by her accent. About the year 1830, to become housekeeper to a married foster sister who settled in a Midland county. This information, and especially the date, Mrs. Green had to answer for. Address. Here followed that of my own solicitors, who had their instructions to keep the lady hanging about the office several days and until they heard from me. I am very much afraid I intended that, should the case appear as black against her as I feared it would, she was to be arrested at the offices of the gentleman to whom she was to apply in order to hear of something to her advantage. And furthermore, I am quite sure that many an unfortunate has been arrested who has been enticed to an office under the promise of something to his or her special benefit. For of such misrepresentations is this deplorable world. When this advertisement came out, the least acute reader is already aware of the use I made of it. I pointed out the news to Mrs. Green, and I have no doubt she digited the intelligence to every soul she met, or rather overtook, in the course of the day. And indeed before evening, when I was honored with a visit from Mrs. Quinion herself, it was stated with absolute assurance that Mrs. Quinion had come in for a good £22,000 and a house in Dyot Street, Bloomsbury Square, London. It was odd, and yet natural, that Mrs. Quinion should seek me out. I was the only stranger with whom she was possibly acquainted in the district, and my strangeness to the neighborhood she had already, from her point of view, turned to account. Therefore, human nature considered, I did not wonder that she tried to turn me to account again. My space is getting contracted, but as the following is the last conversation I had with Mrs. Quinion, I may perhaps be pardoned for here quoting it. Of course I abridge it very considerably. After the usual salutations, and an assurance that Martha suited very fairly, she said, "I have a favor to ask you." "Indeed? Pray, what is it?" "I have received some news which necessarily takes me from home." "I think," I said, smiling, "I know what that news is," and I related how I had myself seen the advertisement in the morning. I am afraid I adopted this course the more readily to attract her confidence. I succeeded. "Indeed," said she, "then since you have identified yourself with that news, I can the more readily ask you the favor I am about to." "And what is that?" "I am desirous of going up to town, to London, for a few hours to see what this affair of the advertisement means, but I hesitate to leave Martha alone in the house. You have started, and perhaps you feel offended that I should ask a stranger such a favor, but the fact is, I do not care to let anyone belonging to the neighborhood know that I have left the Hall. It will be for only 24 hours. The news might reach Mr. Petley's ears, and I desire that he should hear nothing about it. You see the position in which I am placed. If, my dear lady, you can oblige me, I shall be most grateful. And as you are staying here, it seemed to me—" Here she trailed off into silence. The cunning creature! How well she hid her real motive, the desire to keep those who knew of the catastrophe out of the Hall, because she feared their curiosity. Started? Yes, indeed I had started. At best, I had expected that I should have to divulge who I was to the person whom she would leave in the place did the advertisement take. And here, by the act of what she thought was her forethought, she was actually placing herself at my mercy, while I still remained screened in all my actions referring to her. For I need not say that I had to declare who I was, and had I failed, all further slow-trapping in this affair would have been at an end. The game would have taken the alarm, and there would have been an end to the business. To curtail here needless particulars, that same evening at 9 I was installed in the housekeeper's parlor, and she had set out for the first station past tram, to which she was going to walk across the fields in order to avoid all suspicion. She had not got 100 yards away from the house before I had turned up my cuffs, and I and Martha, a couple of detectives, were hard at work trying to find that box. Her keys we soon found in a work-basket and lightly covered with a handkerchief. Now this mode of hiding should have given me a clue, but it did not. For 3 hours, from 9 till midnight, we hunted for that box, and unsuccessfully. In every room that, from the absence of certain dusty evidences, we knew must have been recently opened, in every passage, cellar, corridor, and hall, we hunted. No box. I am afraid that we even looked in places where it could not have gone, such as under beds. But we found it at last, and then the turret clock had gone 12 about a quarter of an hour. It was in her bedroom, and what is more, it formed her dressing table. And I have no doubt I should have missed it had it not been that she had been imperfect in her concealment. Apparently, she comprehended the value of what I may call audacity hiding, that is, such concealment that an ordinary person searching would never dream of looking for the object where it was to be found. For instance, the safest hiding place in a drawing-room for a banknote would be the bottom of a loosely filled card basket. Nobody would dream of looking for it in such a place. The great enigma novelist Edgar Poe illustrates this style of concealment, where he makes the holder of a letter place it in a card rack over the mantelpiece, when he knows his house will be ransacked, and every inch of it gone over to find the document. Mrs. Quinion was evidently acquainted with this mode of concealment. Indeed, I believe I should not have found the box had it not been that she had overdone her unconcealed concealment. For she had used a bright pink slip with a white flounce over it to complete the appearance of a dressing table, having set the box up on one side, and therefore the table attracted my notice each time I passed and saw it. As it was, Martha, in passing between me and the box, swept the drapery away with her petticoats and showed a black corner. The next moment, the box was discovered. I have no doubt that being a strong-minded woman, she could not endure to have the box out of her sight while waiting for an opportunity to get rid of it. It was now evident that my explanation of the case to the effect that young Petley had been imitating the action of the tail was correct. The box was quite large enough to contain a man lying with his legs somewhat up. There was room to turn in the box, and finally there were about 24 holes round the box, about the size of a crown piece, which were hidden by the coarse black canvas with which the box was covered. Furthermore, the box was closable from within by means of a bolt, and therefore openable from within by the same means. Furthermore, if any further evidence were wanting, there was a pillow at the bottom of the box, obviously for the head to rest on, and from a hole the feathers had escaped over the bottom of the box, which was lined with black and white striped linen bed-tick, this material being cut away from the holes. I was now at no loss to comprehend the fluff upon the unhappy young man's coat, and finally there was the most damnifying evidence of all, for in the black canvas over one of the holes there was a jagged cut. "Lie down, Martha," said I, "in the box, with your head at this end." "Why, whatever—" "Tut, tut, girl, do as I tell you." She did, and using the stick of a parasol which lay on the dressing-table, I found that by passing it through the hole, its end reached the officer in exactly the region by a wound in which young Mr. Petley had been killed. Of course, the case was now clear. After the young woman Dinah had gone to bed, the housekeeper must have had her doubts about the chest and have inspected it. Beyond all question, the young man knew the hour at which the housekeeper retired, and was waiting perhaps for 11 o'clock to strike by the old turret clock before he ventured out to commit what? It appeared to me clear, bearing in mind the butler's letter, to rob the plate chest number 13, which I inferred had been left behind, a fact of which the young fellow might naturally be aware. The plan doubtless was to secure the plate without any alarm, to let himself out of the hall by some mode long since well known to him, and then to meet his confederates and share with them the plunder, leaving the chest to tell the tale of the robbery and to exculpate the housekeeper. It struck me as a well-executed scheme, and one far beyond the ordinary run of robbery plots. What had caused that scheme to fail? I could readily comprehend that a strong-minded woman like Quinion would rely rather upon her own than any other assistance. I could comprehend her discovery, perhaps a low-muttered blasphemy on the part of the young man, or maybe she may have heard his breathing. Then, following out her action, I could readily suppose that once aware of the danger near her, she would prepare to meet it. I could follow her silent and self-possessed in the hall, asking herself what she should do. I could mark her coming to the conclusion that there must be holes in the box through which the evildoer could breathe. And I apprehended readily enough that she had little need to persuade herself that she had a right to kill one who might be there to kill her. Then in my mind's eye I could follow her seeking the weapon and feeling all about the box for a hole. She finds it. She fixes the point for a thrust, a movement, and the manslaughter is committed. That the unhappy wretch had time to open the box is certain, and doubtless it was at that moment the fierce woman, still clutching the shaft of the arrow or barb, call it what you will, leant back and so withdrew the shaft from the rankling iron. Did the youth recognize her? Had he tried to do so? From the peacefulness of the face, as described at the inquest, I imagined that he had, after naturally unbolting the lid, fallen back and in a few moments died. Then must have followed her awful discovery, succeeded by her equally awful determination to hide the fault of her master's, and perhaps of her own sister's, son. And so it came to pass that she dragged the youth's dead body out into the cold morning atmosphere as the bleak dawn was filling the air and the birds were fretfully awaking. No doubt, had a sharp detective been at once employed, she would not have escaped detection. As it was, she had so far avoided discovery. And I could easily comprehend that a powerfully brained woman like herself would feel no compunction and little grief for what she had done. No compunction, because the act was an accident. Little grief, because she must have felt she had saved the youth from a life of misery. For a son who at 20 robs a father, however bad, is rarely at 40, if he lives so long, an honest man. But though I had made this discovery, I could do nothing so far against the housekeeper, whom of course it was my duty to arrest if I could convince myself she had committed manslaughter. I was not to be ruled by any feeling of screening the family, the motive indirectly which had actuated Quinion, for strong-minded as she was, it appeared to me that she would not have hesitated to admit the commission of the act which she had completed, had the burglar, as I may call the young man, been an ordinary felon and unknown to her. No, the box had no identification with the death, because it exhibited no unanswerable signs of its connection with that catastrophe. So far, how was it identifiable, beyond my own circumstantial evidence, known only to myself, with the murder? The only particle of evidence was that given by the girl, who could or could not swear to the box having been brought on the previous day, and to the housekeeper saying that it had been taken away again. A suspicious circumstance, certainly, but one which, without corroborative evidence, was of little or indeed no value. As to the jagged cut in the air hole, in the absence of all bloodstain, it was not mentionable. Corroborative evidence I must have, and that corroborative evidence would best take the shape of the discovery of the shaft of the weapon which had caused death, or a weapon of similar character. This, the box being found, was now my work. "Is there any armory in the house, Martha?" "No, but there's lots of arms in the library." We had not searched in the library for the box, because I had taken Martha's assurance that no boxes were there. When we reached the place, I remarked immediately, "What a damp place!" As I said so, I observed that there were windows on each side of the room, and that the end of the chamber was circular. "Well, it may be," said Martha, "for there's water all around it, a kind of fountain pond with goldfish in it. The library," continued Martha, who was more sharp than educated, "butts out of the house." Between each couple of bookcases there was fixed a handsome stand of arms, very picturesque and taking to the eyes. There were modern arms, antique armor, and foreign arms of many kinds, but I saw no arrows, though in the eagerness of my search I had the chandelier, which still held some old yellow wax candles, lighted up. No arrow. But my guardian angel, if there be such good creatures, held tight on to my shoulder that night, and by a strange chance, yet not a tithe so wonderful as that accident by which the woman was saved from a bullet by a piece of just stolen iron, the origin of the weapon used by Quinion came to light. We had been searching amongst the stands of arms for some minutes, when I had occasion suddenly to cry, "Hush! What are you about?" For my confederate had knocked off its hook a large drum, which I had noticed very coquettishly finished off a group of flags and cymbals and pikes. "I'm very sorry," she said, as I ran to pick up the still reverberating drum, with that caution which, even when useless, generally stands by the detective, when, there, sticking through the drum and hooked by its barbs, was the point of such a weapon. The exact counterpart, as it had been used to kill young Petley. Had a ghost, were there such a thing, appeared, I had not been more astounded. The drum was ripped open in a moment, and there came to light an iron arrow with a wooden shaft about 18 inches long, this shaft being gaily covered with bits of tinsel and colored paper. I may here at once state what I ultimately found out, for in spite of our danger I kept hold of my prize and brought it out of battle with me, that this barb was one of such as are used by picadors in Spanish bullfights for exciting the bull. The barbs caused the darts to stick in the flesh and skin. The cause of the decoration of the haft can now readily be comprehended. Beyond all doubt, the arrow used by Quinion and the one found by me were a couple placed as curiosities amongst the other arms. The remaining one the determined housekeeper had used as suiting best her purpose. The other, which I found, had doubtless at some past time been used by an amateur picador, perhaps the poor dead youth himself, with the drum for an imaginary bull, and within it the dart had remained till it was to reappear as a witness against the guilty and yet guiltless housekeeper. I had barely grasped my prize when Martha said, "What a smell of burning!" "Good God!" I cried. "We have set the house on fire!" The house was on fire, but we were not to blame. We ran to the door. We were locked in. What brought her back I never learnt, for I never saw or heard of her again. I guess that the motion of the train quickened her thought. It does mine. That she suspected. That she got out at the station some distance from Tram, and that she took a post-chaise back to Petlicote. All this, however, is conjecture. But if not she, who locked us in? We could not have done it ourselves. We were locked in, and I attribute the act to her, though how she entered the house I never learnt. The house was on fire, and we were surrounded by water. This tale is the story of the unknown weapon, and therefore I cannot logically here go into any full explanation of our escape. Suffice it to our honor as detectives to say that we did not lose our presence of mind, and that by the aid of the library tables, chairs, big books, etc., we made a point of support on one side of the narrow pond for the library ladder to rest on, while the other end reached shallow water. Having made known the history of the unknown weapon, my tale is done, but my reader might fancy my work incomplete did I not add a few more words. I have no doubt that Quinion returning, her quick mind in but a few moments came to the conclusion that the only way to save her master's honor was the burning of the box by the incendiarism of the hall. The Petleys were an old family, I learnt, with almost Spanish notions of family honor. Effectually did she complete her work. I acknowledge she conquered me. She might have burnt the same person to a cinder into the bargain, and upon my word I think she would have grieved little had she achieved that purpose. For my part in the matter, I carried it no further. At the inquiry, I appeared as the lady who had taken care of the house while Mrs. Quinion went to look after her good fortune, and I have no doubt her disappearance was unendingly connected with my advertisement in the Times. I need not say that had I found Quinion, I would have done my best to make her tremble. I have only one more fact to relate, and it is an important one. It is this. The squire had the ruins carefully examined, and 2,000 ounces of gold and silver plate melted into shapelessness of course, were taken out of the rubbish. From this fact, it is pretty evident that the key number 13 found upon the poor, unhappy, ill-bred, and neglected boy was the open sesame to the treasure which was afterwards taken from the ruins, perhaps worth 4,000 pounds, gold and silver together. Beyond question he had stolen the key from the butler, gone into a plot with his confederates, and the whole had resulted in his death and the conflagration of Petlicote, one of the oldest, most picturesque, and it must be admitted, dampest seats in the Midland counties. And indeed I may add that I found out who was the tall gentleman with the auburn whiskers and the twitching of the face. I discovered who was the short gentleman with no whiskers at all. And finally, I have seen the young lady, she was very beautiful, called Frederica, and for whose innocent sake I have no doubt the unhappy young man acted as he did. As for me, I carried the case no further. I had no desire to do so. Had I had, I doubt if I possessed any further evidence than would have sufficed to bring me into ridicule. I left the case where it stood. The end of section 23.
Section 24 of The Female Detective. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Female Detective by Andrew Forrester. The Mystery. It often happens that the police are egregiously foiled, but in all my experience, such a compact case as the following never came under my observation. The incident being grotesque, I have put it into a grotesque, perhaps even an extravagant form. It will be readily seen that it was a case in which the police could easily be thrown completely out, as they were. The sergeant employed to clear up the mystery was, and is, a clever, shrewd man. He has admitted in his most friendly moments that no case so thoroughly mystified him as this, which I now proceed to tell in the admissible shape of a tale. Nellie, said old Bang, he was a very perverse, red-headed old gentleman whose belief in the same personage was quite as perfect as the chorus at Covent Garden. Nellie, I've got a present for you. Have you? Said Nellie. What? She was one of those bright, clear-headed girls who somehow you feel would never come down to breakfast in curl papers and the sulks. You felt that as your wife she never would assail you the moment you entered the house with a complaint that she had seen in a looking-glass Mary Jane insolently squinting at her behind her back, or that she had distinctly remarked the baker blow the cook a kiss down the area steps. One of those women, in fact, who take the hands which are working for them, smile in the husband's face, and even sometimes go before, and still with a cheerful face drag the helpmate after them. Nellie, said old Bang, I've got a present for you. Have you? Said Nellie. What? A husband. Mademoiselle Nellie flung herself at the personage who, upon her advent into this blessed world, had immediately grown an inch in the opinion of his friends and several cubits in his own estimation, and said, "Oh, papa, has Jack spoken?" "Jack? His name's Hezekiah." "Hezekiah what?" asked Nellie. "No," returned matter-of-fact Bang, "Hezekiah Trunk." If she had been a proper young lady, she would have fainted. As it happened, she was only thunderstruck. "He hasn't a hair on his head, papa, but he's got £7,000 in the 3% consols, and—" "But what are they to do with me?" "And," said old Bang, his voice rising, "17 preference shares in the Great Northern." "But I've got no preference for him." "That's nothing to do with it," remarked old Bang. "He's got £7,000 in the 3% consols, and 17—" "Fiddlesticks, papa! I won't hear anything about it. Him, I mean." "Do you know who I am?" asked old Bang. "Yes, I do know you. You're my father, papa." "Do you want to be shut up, Nellie?" "No, papa, I don't." "I'm your father." "And I'm 18. I'm a patient girl, but I can't stand Mr. Hezekiah Trunk." £7,000 in the 3% consols," repeated old Bang, "and 17 preference shares in the Great Northern." "I think I know it," said Nellie. "I shall tell Jack." "Jack who?" said old Bang, ready to explode. "No, Jack Wilson. I shall tell Jack all about it, and then I pity Mr. Trunk and his preference shares too." "You won't accept my present?" "No." "Then I'll lock you up." "Then I'll make you a present instead, papa." "What do you mean?" "Papa, I refuse to state." "Then come along," said old Bang, and he jerked her upstairs till they reached the young lady's own room, the little second-floor front, and there he locked her in. "Don't forget my supper, papa." "Will you have my present?" "No." "Then there you stop." "Very well, then you shall have mine." Perhaps it will hardly be believed that Mrs. Bang had assisted at this interview, but she had, up in a corner and smacking to her hands like the claws of a crayfish, or rather, perhaps, like damp and very lively flounders. She said nothing, if we accept the mild statement, "Bangs bang, and mussy deliver us." Not that Mrs. B. desired to see her good man carried upwards prematurely, but we all have our little ways, and such was Mrs. B.'s, poor dear. Mr. B. did not forget Nellie's supper. As a father he could not give way, but there was mercy in the mass of pudding he sent her up. "Jenny," said Nellie to the official, "would you like your wages raised?" Up went the young person's eyebrows. "Because, if so, you shall, in my house." The young person's eyebrows couldn't go higher, or they would have done it. "Take this letter to its address at once, and wait for an answer." The eyebrows did go higher. "Lor, miss, it's 9:30 o'clock, and I should lose me cracter and me place if I stepped outside the door." "Have the toothache, and say you are going to get it out." "Oh, Lor, no, miss." But every person has her price. To do good. She was not moved by the presentation of Nellie's little turquoise ring, nor the offer of that cameo brooch, but she could not resist the magenta ribbon. Jenny at once had an attack of that ache, said to be imaginary by all people unknown to dentists, and satirical. Down went Jenny to Mrs. B., who, seeing the young person with an apparently swelled face, and certainly a handkerchief round her artful jaw, immediately exclaimed, Must deliver us, go and have it out." Then the young person went. At 10:30 she returned. At 11:25 Miss Nellie had the letter. At 11:20 Miss Nellie began packing up. At 11:25 she had corded all her boxes, hidden them under the bed, and was prepared to fly. How could it be managed? She was locked in her room, and old Bang had actually dragged a heavy chest against the door. Fly, that was it. She left the wings to Jack's providing. She was quite sure that he knew. The letter said, "Dear Nell, keep a bright lookout at 2 in the morning. Will use the license tomorrow at 10. Pack up. There will be no difficulty about the tubs now. Try and forget them. Yours everlastingly, Jack Wilson." Perhaps the intelligent reader has remarked how fond small householders are of bolting the doors and allowing the windows to look after themselves, as though burglars looked on them as walls. Good. Bolt at top of stout door. Bolt at bottom of stout door. Chain put up and key double turned. And there, a little way off, is a tiny window with no shutter and a feeble little bolt. But the door is fast, and so let's go to bed comfortable. It is true that old Bang's place was not a very small household, but he locked up all the doors and bolted and barred and chained like a respectable British tenant as he was. Bang slept in the second-floor front big by the side of Nellie in the second-floor front little, and it need hardly be said Mrs. Bang slept with him. It is very important, however, that this should be remembered. The last thing B did before turning in was to knock at the wall that divided him from Nellie and say, "Will you have my present?" "No," said Nellie. "Then there you stop." "Then, Papa, you must have mine." The first thing B did in the morning was to thwack at the wall again and once more ask. Well, repetition is tedious. There was no answer. Old Bang hit at the wall and once more roared like a bull, "Will you have," etc., etc. No answer. "Bangs, bang, and mussy deliver us," said the good lady, smacking her hands as though the flounders had grown both in circumference and liveliness. "You'd much better get out of bed, ma'am," said Bang, "and pass a petticoat and shake that girl up." Then he rushed to the wall again. "Will you have," etc. Mrs. Bang got up, passed 2 petticoats, one about her dear head to save her from the tic-douloureux to which the poor love was subject. She took the key and left the room. An anxious minute passed. Good, he heard the key turn. The door opened. The next moment he heard a cry, "Mussy deliver us!" Oh! The last word seemed smothered. Bang rushed into the little second-floor front. He saw only a mass of petticoats on the floor, but he could nowhere discover his daughter. In fact, to be very plain, she was gone. Where? How? Old Bang had locked the door and kept the key under his pillow. Ha! Was she under the bed? Old Bang and Mrs. B simultaneously whisked up the valance on opposite sides and stared at each other under those novel circumstances with the air of not having seen each other for a full quarter of a century. Well, she must be somewhere, mustn't she? Well, was she between the mattress and the bed? Mr. and Mrs. B. immediately tousled each other in their efforts in this direction. No, there was nothing but a faint smell of feathers between the bed and the mattress. Mrs. B. was gradually growing cold upwards from the toes. Old B. was boiling. Hang it, she must be somewhere. Ha! Horror! Had she jumped into the area? They rushed madly to the window. They both went to raise it. Ha! It was fast. And now it is necessary to show how it was fast. There is a little fastening which is acted on by the sash. When the sash is brought down, the little fastening is in operation. This is an exceedingly delicate portion of the mystery. Such was the fastening to Nellie's window. It was fast, yet old B and Mrs. B opened the lattice and with eyes of horror peered into the area. No, she was not in the area. Ha! The cupboard. No, she was not in the cupboard. Well, drowning men will catch at a straw, so it is not wonderful that an anxious father as a last resort should investigate the chimney. If Mrs. B had been in a laughing humor, she must have indulged as she saw her bang gradually vanish up the orifice and leave only his shanks to swear by. Suddenly these shanks were convulsed, and B came down quicker than he had gone up. His face was covered with soot, but it did not hide his consternation. He had come crash up against some iron bars, placed there possibly when it was the burglarious fashion to bribe chimney-sweeping lads to creep down these arrangements and open hall doors. Suddenly, old B had an idea. Had Jenny a duplicate key? Upstairs he tore and summoned Jenny in thunderous style. "Oh, sir, is it fire?" asked that maiden. "Have you helped in this business?" "Oh, sir, help me, pray, if it's danger." "Where's Miss Nellie?" "Oh, sir, hadn't you better ask her?" Downstairs came Bang, not a sign of getting out of the house in a legitimate way. He had taken the street door key to bed as usual. He had possessed himself of the area door key as usual. Query: had Nellie got out at the front kitchen window and clambered over the area railings? Query: how could she have first got out of her room? Query: had Jenny unlocked the door? Query: how could she? All this time Mrs. B was smacking her hands dolefully and sitting in her flannel on the floor, ejaculating, "Oh, my poor, poor daughter!" Query: had Mrs. B heard anything in the night? No. Yes. That is, perhaps. She woke because she thought she was going to have the tic-toleroo. She thought she heard a rumbling. Then she fell asleep again. Then she woke again because she felt sure she was going to have the tic-toleroo. It was at this period she thought she heard someone utter a peculiar cry. What was it like? Why, like Luliati. Then she heard a rumbling again, that was all, and then she fell asleep again. By this time Jenny was shivering in her clothes, and the other young person, Mary, was trembling in her garments, and neither could light the kitchen fire. Mary had staggers, to which she was subject. Directly Jenny was sent for a detective policeman. Sergeant Gimlet, oh, such a man! But he was foiled. You see, says the sergeant, a rope ladder were not it for why. It were have been fastened to this here windy cell, and no fastening is, and besides, she'd a come down on the hairy spikes. It were a ladder, though were it, I'm doubters. Try every ladder in the neighborhood, says old B, and up to 1 o'clock, to which time Mrs. B had never once left off clapping her hands, or the young persons trembling. Mary, poor soul, had had 7 staggers. Up to 1 o'clock they had found as many ladders. This one ladder B had brought to the house, and as after 10 minutes' contention with the area railings, the only result achieved was driving it clean through the drawing-room window, the experiment was not felicitous, especially as its owner swore all the time and wanted to know whether Sergeant Gimlet thought him a complice of burglars. The ladder would not reach the 2nd floor within 6 feet, and it was impossible to believe that Nellie could have taken such a step down in life as that. The mystery was marvelous. "You see," said Sergeant Gimlet, "it were not a ladder which. Why, builders won't run ladders o' night time, 'cause why, it looks burglarious." Again, it took all of a quarter o' an hour to bring that ladder here, and 10 minutes to fix it with half a dozen fellers, and then it went through the windy. Now, do you think as a party could be with a ladder in the street in the night for a quarter to the place, a quarter at the house without smashing glass, and a quarter back again without being seen by one of the force? No, it weren't a ladder. Then what was it? Sergeant Gimlet never had said, "I don't know," so he inquired, "Are you quite sure she were there?" This was too much. Indignation was in the very rattle of the 5-pound Bank of England note old B held out to the officer. Whereon, "No," said Gimlet, "no, I never takes no money as I don't earn, though fivers is more scarce with me than they may be with some folk. I'd blessed be if I wouldn't pay one in installments to tell how your gal's hooked." Mrs. B had not yet done clapping her hands. Jenny still had the creeps, and Mary was recovering her 8th stagger on the kitchen sofa. It was 5 o'clock. Tat, tat. The shock was so great that Mary nearly had her 9th. Upstairs Jenny tore. A letter, Yoop! She had caught her breath. Miss Nellie's handwriting. "You see, Papa, I'm quite safe. When shall I come home with my present? Advertise in the 2nd column of the Times. Goodbye. Love to all. Nellie." Quite safe. Then old B was in a rage again. Mrs. B, who was quite sure she had got the tic douloureux by this time, all owing to staring at the broken drawing-room window per the experimental ladder, beat her hands in such an agony that she looked quite low. No, she should never darken his doors again. Never. No, he would never own her again. Yet she must have got away somehow. No, not once more. But old Bang was soft-hearted and very curious. He would have come round sooner or later, but the agony of the mystery made short work of his indignation. The next day but one, the following appeared in the second column of the Times. Dear Nellie, return home. All is forgiven. Bring your present. That afternoon a cab drove up to the door. In it, Nellie and her present, Jack Wilson. I've a respect for old Bang, so I shall not dilate upon how he tried to play Brutus and broke down and performed the part of a clear-headed father. You know, sir, said Jack, I shall have more than £7,000 in the 3% consols before I am Trunk's age. And the 17 preference shares, old B began, in the Great Northern? Well, I've got 7 of them already, for Uncle Trunk gave 'em me this morning. Oh, yes, Trunk's my maternal uncle, for the clever way in which I won Nellie here. And how the devil did you do it, sir? Why, remarked Jack Wilson, a dashing, clear-headed young man, I just went round the corner and bribed the fire escape. Don't tell anyone, or you may get the firemen into a row. No, I won't, said old B, in a mild and annihilated manner. No, not at all. But he did, or how should I come to know it? Wasn't it odd? End of section 24. End of The Female Detective by Andrew Forrester.